Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the Purple Track at Apisecure 2023. With us today, we have a fantastic speaker, Ian Douglas, who is a senior developer advocate at Postman. Hello, Ian. How are you?
Hi, Mel. Good. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. We're super excited about your talk, and I will kick it off to you to get started.
Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for attending today. My name is Ian Douglas. I'm a senior developer advocate at Postman. I've been at the company a little over a year, but I've been in the tech industry for almost 3 decades now. So I've seen some things, and we're going to talk a little bit about API contracts. What are they, and how can we get into security? So these are the kind of the main takeaways that we're going to go through today. What is API contract testing? How is that going to help us with securing our APIs? From there, we're going to talk a little bit about contract validation testing for API producers. And I'm going to walk you through some tools that you can use to do that and how that's going to help with security. And then at the end, we'll get into a little bit of contract validation on the consumer side of your API as well. And if we've got time, we'll do some questions. So just for the sake of anyone here who's not familiar with the term, I want to make sure everyone knows what we mean when we talk about what API contracts are. So most of us are going to think about API contracts as the agreement provided by an API producer as part of their documentation to the end user, which promises that if you call an API endpoint with certain parameters, that you're going to get a specific type of response. The end user, though, sometimes thinks that the API contract is just the data structure of what's actually being returned in the response. Like, this is what you promised to give me for data. Engineering teams and governance teams might build a contract about this is how we want you to actually build an API from a design point of view and from a standards perspective. And it's kind of all of these things when we talk about what an API contract actually is. So I like to think about API contract testing in several ways, and it really leads to confidence in your application. But that alone doesn't necessarily lead to security. So bear with me as we kind of go through these ideas, and we'll talk about how security plays a role here. So we're going to start with our API definition. This is whatever your team starts out with in their design phase to plan the API and maybe use that definition to generate your documentation, code samples, maybe start work on things like client software development kits, SDKs. There are a ton of automated tools out there that can take something like an open API specification file and start to generate some of this work for you so that you can get feedback on the design of your API before you ever write a single line of code. Now, governance should be a big part of your sort of API first strategy, and it should include your security team right from the start, where you want to sit down, you want to review your design, and then you want to scrutinize it, plan out what you really want it to do, and then kind of review it and scrutinize it again for only what it needs to do. When we look at the OWASP API top 10, for example, we see a handful of things related to things like data leakage, and we're going to discuss that too. And that's where we kind of get into the idea of, what does this really need to do versus what do we want it to do? The next point on my list here is to check that the specification that you came up with actually conforms to industry standards. But why is that important? Well, all of those automated tools that I just mentioned aren't going to work very well if your spec file doesn't conform properly to that high-level specification design. I've actually seen tools fail to work properly because of something in a spec file. For example, it had a camel case variable name instead of being all lowercase. No warning, no error from the tool. It just didn't work. So I'm going to show you some tools that you can use to automate these scans for conformity. In this example that I'm going to show today is going to be the Open API specification. Now, this step is a more indirect way of improving your security because some of these fancy automated tools include security scanning tools from the companies whose talks you're enjoying this week. So finally, we're going to talk about end user schema validation and some of the basics that you'll need to ensure that your data payload matches exactly what your design says that you'll do and what your automatically generated documentation is telling your users to expect. But you should also have some basic principles in place about how to write some testing code to watch out for common things in the OWASP API top 10, and I'll show you a little bit of that as time allows. So let's talk about the producer side of things. From the organization point of view of designing and building the API itself, and how this contract testing can aid your security. This does, of course, make some presumptions about your governance team, that they've done at least a little bit of security design work before you build the API spec in the first place. And again, I'll be showing you how to do this with an open API spec, but ultimately the point here is to find a good validation tool or scanner that can make sure that your specification actually conforms to the standards committee that put that together, so that you can continue to use all of these other tools for other security checks. So as a side note, I'm going to describe how to do this in the Postman application, but how you ultimately build out your open API specification file is up to you and your organization. Postman has some good tooling for building and testing an API right within the app and synchronizing that back and forth with your favorite code repository, setting up CI/CD pipelines, publishing your API so 20 million other people can find it, just saying. But the automated tool that I'm going to show you here today actually runs inside of Postman. So you will need a workspace made inside of Postman to use this, which also requires you to be logged in. But everything I'm going to describe here is available on all of the account types at Postman, including the free account. So this slide is just the high level steps. I'm going to show you on the next few slides how to access everything. So step one inside of Postman is to actually go build an API. So in the context bar on the left side, you're going to click on the APIs icon. Now, whether you want to make it from nothing, or if you want to import an existing file or synchronize it from a code repository, that's totally up to you. We have great step-by-step guides in the software, plenty of documentation, plus we got a wonderful community forum if things really start to go sideways for you while you work through this. The next screen, once you tell Postman that you want to create a new API, we're going to scroll down to the bottom of that page, and that comes up here that I'm showing highlighted on the screen, and we're going to click on the plus sign next to the definition and tell the software that I want to make a brand new specification file. Now, this is also where you could import it from an existing file if you've already got that on your system. And you can see in the middle of the slide where you can connect to a code repository, but the code repository synchronization only works if you're on a paid account. If you're on a free account, you'll be limited to what I've got highlighted here right now. So we're going to start with a new definition, and that's going to ask what kind of specification you want to make. And on that panel, which is not shown on the slides, I'm going to specify that I'm going to make an open API specification. It'll ask what version of the open API spec. In my case, I'm going to choose version 3. And then it'll ask whether I want to write this in JSON format or YAML format. And I'm going to choose YAML on mine. So kind of the next step along, here's where I've written out my specification. Postman is also going to allow you now to split specifications into multiple files so that you don't have to build one enormous spec file anymore, but you will have to know how to access your components within the Open API spec from other files using things like references. But at this point, we're all done building out our API. So next, we're going to use the search bar at the top of Postman, and we're going to search for the words contract test generator, and make sure that you find the result that's authored by Postman. It'll have the actual Postman username right next to it, and it should be right at the top of the list of the results. But before you click through to that, you want to make sure that you remember the name of the workspace that you're working in right now, because you're going to need that in a moment. So when we look at the collections from this workspace, you'll see that my coworker, Jordan, who put this together at Postman, has some work in place for both Open API version 3 and version 2. You can pick whichever version applies to you, and then you'll click on the 3 dots next to the collection, and you're going to choose the option to create a fork. Now, just like a code repository, this forking is happening the same way. It's going to remember a reference back to this so that if, say, Jordan makes a change, you can get notified and you can actually pull those changes down into your forked copy. On that next screen, though, you're going to be asked for a workspace target of where you want to copy this work into, and that's where you're going to need to remember the name of your previous workspace. There's a drop-down list that'll show up in there. Now, when you create the fork, Postman is automatically going to take you back to your workspace and show you what it copied over, but we actually need to come back to this screen because there's one more thing that we have to fork before we can move on from here. So when we come back to the contract test generator, this time we're actually going to fork over the environments. So there's an environment in here that we need to copy over as well. And the documentation in Jordan's workspace will tell you how to configure it. There's an ID value of the workspace that you need to configure in the environment. And you'll also need a Postman API key that you'll need to copy in here as well. There are some security implications about how to store those within your environment, and I'm happy to talk offline about some best practices about what to do there. All right, we're almost done. So the next step that we want to do is we want to go into the collection runner. So clicking on the collection itself, you can use the three dots that we looked at before, and there's an option in there that says run the collection. Or if you close out the documentation panel, you'll see a run icon along the top, and this will bring you to this screen where we can actually run Jordan's collection within your workspace where you defined your API. We're actually going to run Jordan's collection from here. But before we do that, we see in the top right corner of the user interface that we actually have to choose the environment that we configured. There were only two options in that environment that you need to set as a Postman API key and your workspace ID. And then you can go ahead and hit that run generator button down at the bottom of the screen. This next slide has an animation that's basically going to walk you through. So when you run the collection, if everything's configured correctly, what you should see is that this collection is actually generating a ton of test code on the fly to check that your OpenAPI specification file actually conforms properly to the OpenAPI specification standards. Depending on the size of your OpenAPI specification file, this could generate a couple of dozen tests. I've actually seen this produce as many as 500 or 600 tests on the fly, and it's going to go through and it's going to check for all those different syntaxes, uppercase, lowercase things, are your references set properly? It's going to go through and scan all of that for you. But how does this actually help you with security? Well, this just went through and it analyzed every little detail about your specification and all of your data types and so on. Um, so now you've got this extra layer of confidence that now you can go run any other third-party tool against your specification and not worry about whether you did something just slightly off in your definition that could cause a security problem down the line. So this was what I was saying earlier in the presentation, where this is like an indirect way of enhancing the security of your API. So before we move on to the consumer side, I want to mention one other scanning tool that we have within Postman, and that's a search that you can look for in the search bar in Postman called Documentation Leaking Credentials. But this is also built into Postman. And so even on the free accounts, if you go through and build out an API and you actually tell Postman that you want to publish documentation for your API, we're actually going to scan through that for you to see whether you're leaking any credentials in that documentation. So it's going to look for things like API keys or passing credentials and so on into your API. And it will send you both an email alert, and you'll also see some pop-up alerts inside of Postman if it thinks that you've leaked any kind of credential as part of that documentation, so that you can unpublish it right away. And then you can go in and you can try to fix what was leaked within your documentation. So again, you can search for the words documentation leaking credentials if you want to do that manually. Otherwise, anytime you try to publish documentation, Postman will scan through that and look for those things for you. All right, so that's all fine and good. What about the consumer side of things? How do we check that they're not trying to do something that they shouldn't? This is where a lot of the OWASP top 10 comes into play. And so there are plenty of tools out there that are going to help to analyze your API. Some of them take a little bit long to run. Some of them are more thorough than others. But we can also do some amount of contract testing inside of Postman as well. And again, how you define that API contract, is it just the data payload, or is it some combination of the parameters and the payload and so on? The nice thing is you don't have to be a security expert here, but being familiar at least with the OWASP API top 10 will help you out. And I'm going to talk about a few high-level concepts that you can test right within Postman to test the consumer side of your API. Now, these concepts should be general enough that you can apply them to any test-driven or behavior-driven development work and not be specific to a Postman collection, but I am going to show you how to do this inside of Postman. So the number one thing on the OWASP API list is broken object level authorization, where an attacker could send in a query parameter with the user ID, and maybe get by some security checks on the API. But in this case, we actually want to test if I send a cookie with that API request with someone else's user ID, am I actually getting my user payload back, or is the API actually paying attention to what's in the cookie? So how do we protect against this? Well, I took a pretty quick and simple approach here in the code that basically says if I'm sending a user ID as a query parameter, then I expect that query parameter's value to show up in my response body as the same user ID. And if those don't match, then maybe my API isn't behaving properly. So if we actually look through the code, what's happening here, the first thing I'm doing that we can see on line 4 of this chunk of code is we're saying, take that response that we got from calling our API, and we want to unpack that JSON into a data structure. And then from there, I expect that data structure to have a property called user ID. Line 10 is basically where we're saying, go back to our Postman request that we sent and go unpack all of those query parameters and build an object out of that, so that on line 13, I can say, I expect my data payload user ID to equal my query parameter user ID. So this is just one example of what we would call behavior-driven testing. Postman includes the chai library to be able to set up these expectations and assertions that once we call this API request and get the response back, it's going to run this code and it'll help spot check this a little bit. The number 3 thing on the OWASP list is excessive data exposure. Sometimes as developers, we can be a little lazy sometimes, and we end up sending way too much data back to the client. This is especially found in RESTful APIs, where we're either underfetching or we're overfetching our data. And thinking that, you know what, our client-facing software is just going to strip away whatever we don't want the actual end user to see. I used to play an online game, for example, that was geolocation based. And with a little bit of effort, players were able to actually scrape that API for data about the game, which sounded fun and geeky, and we got to sort of manipulate the game a little bit. But some users took it a little too far, because by looking at the game events that were happening, the data leakage actually showed where users were within the game. And so some malicious users actually started tracking down where other players worked or where other players lived in order to harass them from playing the game. And so we want to make sure that we can find ways of making sure that our API is only sending what we intend to send it. So in the example that I've got on this slide here, I'm going and maybe fetching some user contact information, but maybe the payload that we're getting back, we're not just sending back the user ID and whether they're an admin, but maybe we're leaking other details like where their last location was or what their home address is, with the idea that, well, the front end software isn't actually going to show that. So I'm just going to reuse this endpoint that's over sending all of this data. But if a malicious user intercepts that API call or does something like a man-in-the-middle attack or something like that, they can extract this data where maybe we didn't mean for them to see that. So how do we protect against this? While it's more work for us as developers to write multiple endpoints that heavily restrict the amount of data returned, having that zero trust mindset is extremely beneficial. So in this test, for example, I'm looking at how many attributes come back from my server and expect that I only see a total of 2 attributes. And if that fails, then I know that I'm not sending the correct amount of data, and I can examine the response to see what happened. So if I get 3 object parameters back or 10 object parameters back, I know that I'm potentially leaking data. But if that does pass, then I also want to make sure that the specific attributes I'm looking for actually exist. So we need to go a little bit deeper than just saying, I expect 2 pieces of information back. I want to know that I'm getting the correct 2 pieces of information back. And so what I'm doing here is I'm actually checking that what I should see in my response is an attribute called user ID and an attribute called isAdmin and nothing else. So this does raise an interesting question about things like GraphQL, because like I mentioned in RESTful APIs, we tend to overfetch data. But with something like GraphQL, it's typically up to our client software to determine which fields are being returned and how can we limit the number of attributes returned from a GraphQL query if a malicious user wants to try to leak extra data. Again, by having a single endpoint that you're hitting where you're just sending a specific query, malicious users can actually watch those API calls and start to learn or even guess at what your table names are and what your field names are in order to try to mimic that request to see what comes back in the response to see whether they can actually leak your data. So the best practice here is to actually continue to write more restrictive queries that have limited access to the kinds of tables and fields that are not going to leak the sensitive data that we don't want malicious users to see. So I know that that was a little bit fast, but the point of the consumer side contract testing is that even a minimum amount of security training can help you scan and screen for things, especially if your organization has you in a position where you're expected to scan for these types of vulnerabilities before they invest in other tools. Educating yourself on what to look for and how to be clever about writing your tests can help with some amount of screening, but nothing is going to beat exhaustive testing tools like, say, Zap from the OWASP project. But these tools, though, they're really great when they work really fast because nobody wants to wait a day or a week to get audit results back. We want them in seconds or minutes. But that's also not an excuse not to do any testing just because we want something fast. At some point, you are going to need some sort of automated testing. So writing tests, running collections, that's fine, but going in and manually doing this stuff all the time isn't really that fun. So Postman includes a tool called Monitors, which can run your collection requests on a regular basis. You can think of it like a cron job inside of Postman. We also have command line tools like Postman CLI, or you might have heard of the community-driven project called Newman, which work great with CI/CD pipelines to help halt your deployment if tests don't pass. So whether you're running the specification conformity scanner that I showed early in my presentation from Jordan, or whether you're using the documentation scanner that I mentioned briefly, which you can also run as a set of tests, or whether you're running additional layer of testing on the consumer side of your API contract, you're going to know immediately if something doesn't behave properly. The Postman monitors will typically send an alert within the application. It'll also send you an email. You can specify how frequently you want to get those emails. You can also promote those security concerns all the way up to admin levels within your Postman team if you're setting up your rule-based access controls. So thanks for listening, and thank you for your time. We love being part of these events, and we'd love to hear feedback from you. You can reach me on Twitter as IanDouglas736, and my Twitter bio has a link tree in there that can also get you over to my Mastodon account if you'd like to reach out there. I would love any questions or feedback that you have. I'm also happy to connect offline with questions. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a fantastic community forum where you can ask as many questions as you like.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian, for that presentation. I found it very beneficial. One thing I wanted to ask is you mentioned something about governance, and I'm sure in your role, supporting other developer teams, it's kind of at times can be challenging to communicate certain things and to follow a standard. So what are some things you could recommend to the audience on, where to start, where to kind of find those resources and strategies?
That's a great question. And I think I should probably start with what is governance in the first place, because sometimes we hear these buzzwords or like, shifting left or what is API first. So let's define that a little bit. So my idea of governance is really kind of it's an encapsulation of the design of what you want your API to be, where you're also taking into consideration different people on your team. Because again, we need viewpoints from multiple angles of how are we designing the API? How do we want to build the API? How are we doing security? How are we doing documentation? The idea with governance is that you're planning out as much as possible before you build anything. If you've already got an API, though, you can still build a governance team that's going through and kind of looking at these design things and sort of doing that scrutiny that I mentioned earlier. As far as resources on how to get started with governance, it really depends on, and I hate the answer, it depends, but it really does depend on what your organization wants to do from a governance perspective. But Postman has a lot of blog posts. We've got teams of people that would be happy to speak to you about like what does it mean to build a governance team, and the idea of like shifting left. That's basically how do we do more of that testing, pushing that testing down to the development of the API as opposed to waiting for a QA team or a security team to try to audit what we build much later on. We want to try to do as much of that screening before it gets down that pipeline. So if you imagine a pipeline going from left to right, we want to shift that responsibility to the left, which puts it back closer to the developer from there.
No, it's fantastic. And, what about documentation? I mean, as you know, with developers, engineer types, it's hard because they're doing the day to day, they're keeping the lights on, they're maintaining, but it's always good to have these documented so that one, you can see an audit trail, two, it's there for the ongoing
Mhm.
teams. And also if there are any updates within the platform or API in particular, they can refer back to what they actually had initially. So what are some good tools that you use, or is there even a forum out there where they know easily how to create these playbooks, so to speak?
So a playbook from a security point of view, or the playbook of what is your API supposed to be doing and
What
what's
is
your
Yeah, what is your API? What's the purpose of an API,
gotcha.
and so forth. I mean, from a security standpoint, there's always going to be that framework, and OWASP does a really great job on dictating what is considered the top 10 that you should follow.
Mhm.
But I'm thinking more of a governance side, so that the
Right.
developer team or engineering team who's managing and continuing to maintain the APIs can understand what's happening. And for me,
Mhm.
as an operator, I always like to see good documentation, regardless of what teams are out there and supporting these applications.
Yeah, great question. So I mean, Postman will automatically generate documentation based on an open API specification for you, as well as if you're just building a collection manually. So if you build a Postman collection, you've got all the different requests in there. If you're building that out manually from your own API, and there are tools that can also scan an API and build a Postman collection for you. Those are like community driven tools. But once you have all of those inside of Postman, Postman will actually automatically generate documentation for you. You can turn around, you can publish that documentation to the general public, and that usually will also generate a button that says, hey, go run my collection in Postman where people can fork what you build. So that documentation will get built automatically. As you call those collection requests, you can save responses as examples, and those examples then will also show up in that documentation. So as soon as you make a change to something, we update that documentation and it's live right away. If you're publishing the documentation, then you need to unpublish and republish, but it's literally like a couple of mouse clicks and everything's back up to date. Just that way you can kind of screen it a little bit before you publish it. But that's also where that screening tool comes in that I mentioned, that when you publish your documentation, we'll look for some things like, are you leaking credentials as part of these examples? But within Postman, if you're trying to get into that documentation stage, this is also really helpful for planning out what you want your API to be for the governance perspective. So if you're working from an OWASP specification, or sorry, Open API specification file, or whether you're doing GraphQL, gRPC, anything along those lines, we'll automatically build documentation for you. At which point, then your team can look through that documentation and try to scrutinize that and review that very carefully to determine, is this what we want our API to be? And so this helps with the governance idea of planning out your API before you ever start building anything, because that will allow you to look at the documentation, look through the design. We've also got some low code, no code kinds of options that you can look at within Postman to kind of, if you do have portions of the API written, you can actually start getting non-developers involved with working through that API just to kind of get a sense of, is this what we intend to build? And then you can actually go build the whole thing. And so it really does help from that design point of view for what we call governance, where you've got multiple teams involved that are looking at the documentation, looking at your overall standards. What do you want to do as a company? How does this company want to build that API? And then ideally, that governance team would be the same governance team over all of the APIs that you build as a company, so that any user using any of your APIs, they have a very uniform sort of feeling about that API. They all look the same, they all act the same, the documentation format is all the same. And that's really what a lot of the governance team can help to drive.
That's perfect. No, it's really good, and I'm glad that there's functionality within the tool itself, because that makes it easier than having disparate, tools and panes of glass to look back and to reference, right?
Yeah.
My next question is going back to, and I know you mentioned one pretty big threat in APIs, which is BOLA and excessive data exposure. What are some ways, or I should say, what are some cadences that you can do? Obviously, in the beginning, you're doing shift left, so you're protecting these from all these different types of vulnerabilities out there. What are some validation processes that you do? Do you do it annually? Do you do it quarterly? What are some good recommendations to continually check for these threats and new threats in the wild?
It depends. It depends on your deployment cadence. I mean, if you're deploying regularly, you should be scanning regularly. You should have the security scanning as part of your deployment process. And so ideally, your developers have some amount of security training. But again, they don't have to be security experts, but at least understanding, like, hey, if you're sending a payload, make sure you're only sending these attributes. Like, don't send anything else. And having some amount of testing in place that you can check for, are we leaking data, or are we missing something, or can someone get around our security? Those were the examples that I showed in the slides. But I know of teams that deploy several times every day on their API, and so the security screening has to be part of that, because if you're deploying that code 5 times a day, you need 5 security scans, and those scans have to be fast in order to make sure that what you're actually deploying on a regular basis isn't causing any sort of data leakage or getting around authorization, and so on. Like, when we look at the 2019 OWASP API top 10, 3 of the 10 things were about just broken authorization, like, can, or authentication as well. Like, can they get around the authentication, and then can they escalate their privilege? The proposed 2023 list, 5 of the 10 things are going to be about authorization. So we see that as a much bigger threat now. So having some awareness as a developer, as we do this shift left, like put more of that responsibility closer to the developer. I think having any kind of automated tools that are going to help with that security scanning is going to be really critical, but it needs to happen as part of your automatic deployment process. And that's where the CI/CD pipelines can come into play. There are a lot of great companies out there that are doing that as part of a CI/CD pipeline. But building some of your own tests and just testing that, whether you're using Postman CLI or Newman, where the developer can write some of these at least initial stage, like really high level sort of threat checks before it goes into that pipeline, it'll just make those audits a little bit faster. But whatever tool you're using, it's got to be fast, because as a developer, I don't want to sit and wait for a whole bunch of tests to pass. I don't want to, you know, take a really long time for that. Otherwise, it's going to slow me down. It's going to slow my process down. And it's going to ultimately kind of slow everything else down along the line. And so, as much as possible, we need those tools to be fast. We need the testing to be fast. But as I said, that's not an excuse for us to be lazy and say, well, I need it fast, so I'm just not going to do any testing. When you're under a deadline, documentation and testing tend to be the first 2 things you don't do. But then you end up with disappointed customers. Or in this case, for the purpose of a security conference, you can end up with security problems. And so you have to have
Mhm.
something in place. So whether it's your governance team or just better practices and better principles of, this is what we want you to build, but this is also how we expect you to build it, that's also going to be coming from that governance team. And that's why that governance team has to include people from a security mindset.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I love your answer to the, just this constantly having to test, right? And I know everyone says it depends, because it depends on the cap, it depends on, how often they have to do it, resources, and, downtime as well, if there's any patches that have to be done, right?
Mhm.
Um, what about, and switching tracks a little bit, because now that with all the hype on API security the last, I don't know, 3, 4 years, 5 years, what are, if a company comes in and goes, okay, I'm a CISO, I'm a CTO, now I have to start thinking about API security. I don't know how many APIs I have in my environment. I don't have a team, but I do have I can pull people from different engineering and developer teams. What are some easy, quick wins that they can do immediately that's cost effective to get them on the right track to one, discovery, identifying what those APIs are, and then building a program, so to speak, any type of governance or cadence that helps them with discovery, and then making sure they are safe from any, top vulnerabilities out there.
Yeah, great question. I would say if you're building a cross-functional team across many, many teams, I would say bring like your higher level architects and senior developers who know about the APIs that you've been building. And then if you've got these specification files like OpenAPI or GraphQL, if you've got those specs or even like gRPC proto files, like bring that stuff to a meeting and say, these are all the APIs we have. Catalog those in one place, whether it's a tool like Postman. I mean, I would love for everyone to be using Postman. But bring all of that into one place where you've got that visibility of these are all the different kinds of APIs that we have. And then from a cost effective point of view, there are lots of free tools out there. Like OWASP has the Zap utility, for example, that you can go through and you can scan your entire web application and to some degree your APIs as well. And there are other companies out there who are working by, at building Zap into a CI/CD pipeline, for example. There's several companies starting to do this now. And I think that that's a really cost-effective way if you've got the engineering time and so on within your organization to install that kind of thing yourself as part of that pipeline, great. But there are a lot of businesses out there that'll help you with that as well. And I think that that's probably the fastest way to get up and running, but you have to catalog all of these APIs to begin with, and having some sort of tool where you can bring all of these things together and say, this is kind of the one sort of source of truth of where we're going to put all these specifications. It's okay to develop them and put them in code repositories and so on, but get them under one sort of collective roof, so to speak, of this is where we're going to keep all these definitions. This is where we're going to kind of look at things from lots of different angles. And whether it's a tool like Postman, again, you've got one place where you're kind of putting all these specification files that you can go through and do that scrutiny and do the initial sort of testing on like what is our design, what is, are these things going to conform properly to their individual specifications, and then using the automated tools to like start building out documentation, sometimes even building out your code and building out SDKs and so on. If you've already got an API and you've already got like an open API spec, there are automated tools out there as well that can turn that into a Postman collection, or vice versa. If you've got a Postman collection, you can scan through that and it'll start to make the shell of an open API specification for you if you don't already have that. A lot of modern frameworks, though, that I'm seeing are actually, as I'm going into, say, .NET and building out an API in .NET, there's a plugin that you can install in .NET, and it'll automatically make an open API specification file for you as you're just building out your code. It'll start to kind of build out the framework of what that open API spec is. That's not going to be thorough and complete, though. You're still going to have to go in and like fill in all the details according to best practices about having examples and having documentation right in that spec file. And then, like I said, Postman will take that spec file and it'll also help automate a lot of things. And so it can kind of compound into each other. You get started and you do a thing, you bring it into Postman, we'll make it a little bit bigger and better, and you continue to do the thing and it'll get bigger and better. But the more of that you can automate as part of that process, the better off your team's going to be.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. You answered like 5 or 6 of my follow-up questions that I had in the talk. Well, Ian, thank you so much for the discussion. I really enjoyed talking to you. Are there any last thoughts you want to leave with the audience?
No, well, thank you for your questions as well. They were very thoughtful as well. Yeah, I'd say that the whole idea of like shifting left and buzzwords like governance and API first sometimes are a little tricky to understand. So definitely go look those things up if you're unsure what they are. Postman has a fantastic community. We're happy to help people kind of understand these topics and dive in a little bit more on what the Postman application can do to help you out. We've got a really great DevRel team, which I'm a part of, that we're constantly going around and giving lots of talks at different kinds of conferences on different kinds of things, and we love interacting with people. So definitely find us on Twitter. Some of us are also on Mastodon now, and you can definitely find us there. Ask us these tough questions. We would love to help you kind of track down answers and things like that. So please reach out to me. I'm just Ian Douglas, and add the number 736 on the end, and you'll find me on most platforms. And I'd be happy to help you out if you've got further questions.
Awesome. Thank you again, Ian. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Mel. Have a great day, everybody.
Take
Cheers.
care. You too.